Hi, so thanks so much for joining me today. I'm Barbara Mangum. I'm the president of the board of trustees at the Somerville Museum, which used to be the Somerville Historical Society. In the 1980s, it was changed to the museum. And then also I'm the founder and president of Historic Somerville. And our goal is basically to preserve and entertain and educate people here in Somerville about Somerville's history and preserve anything that we consider cultural patrimony or historical. So we could do oral histories or places like this. We've kind of adopted the Milk Road Cemetery because it's such a wonderful place. And it really needed a lot of care when we started about 10 years ago. And it's doing much better, but these cemeteries will always need a certain amount of care just because the stones tend to get lifted up in frost heaves and then they kind of just fall over and break, and then you got to put them back together. Hopefully with prevention, you get to them before they fall over. So I think Brandon Wilson's going to join us, and she'll probably send a paper around to you all to write your names down in case you want to be added to our event list or anything like that. So what I wanted to do is to start with the history here, and it's kind of the chronological history of this cemetery. So very early on, this was farmland. This was Samuel Tuff's farm, and that was from the early 1700s on. And over there, that was Nathaniel Hawkins' farm, right where Market Basket is and that kind of thing. And right up there was a little schoolhouse, and it was a one-room schoolhouse, and it was actually for boys and girls, which I think is very progressive. And Samuel Tufts was actually one of the kind of superintendents that looked out for the school. And we don't know exactly why, but possibly because his brother Timothy, maybe he was getting ill or something, but he's decided in 1804 to set this property aside for a cemetery. So you actually had to get a deed for it to have it deeded as a cemetery at the time. So he did that, and he deeded it for his family and friends, and thereafter the tombs were built. So what's kind of interesting is that if you look over here, you can actually see that it says Samuel Tufts, and then it gives the date, and it says 1805, and tomb number 1. And if you look over there, it says Timothy Tufts, and then it gives the date of 1805, tomb number 2. Samuel Tufts did not die until 1828. So he had the tomb built, but he didn't actually utilize it until later. His brother, however, died the next year. So that's why I kind of wonder if he, had that in his mind when he set aside this property and had the tombs built. So inside the tombs, people are often very interested as to what the tombs are like. And they're actually a brick structure that would be kind of, like this. And you go inside them and there would be kind of like shelves. And that's where the dead would be. You don't see any of the women's names on here, but he's there as head of household. And so the people inside are those who are related to him. So his wife would probably be there as well, even though she's not actually mentioned. And that goes on down here. And then when you get to the third tomb, the people who are listed there are generally his son-in-laws. So again, we don't see, he had 5 children. We don't see their names here. But what we do see is his grandchildren are all out in this area, okay? So a lot of the people that you see here are the friends and neighbors, and they're also the grandchildren. Now, there was a great-grandchild named Jonathan Frost, and he actually came at one point to be the person who was in charge of the cemetery, and this was about 1840. And at that time, he decided that anyone in town could pay $1 and they could have a plot here as long as they fenced it in. So at the time, they probably still had animals kind of walking around and everything. So you had to take care of your plot and you had to fence it in. So we have a picture, unfortunately I don't know that I brought with me, but for instance, that plot, the size of the plot is the size that you now see around the monument. That would be a family plot. And then, so each one of these other areas here, as we go over there, we'll see that, in fact, we can head on over a little bit. You'll see where the markers were that were for the corner posts. They're still in the ground in some of the cases there. We know there was a picture taken in the about 1870s that showed cast iron fencing, which is what would have been quite typical of the period. If you go to Mount Auburn Cemetery, you'll see some really nice examples of that same kind of cast iron fencing there, and it would have been here as well. It was actually quite attractive. But eventually it became hard to take care of in the climate, you know, that we have. The cast iron rusted, and then eventually there would be something like a war effort and everybody would need the metal and it would be melted down for that, or also anything. You know, it's interesting, they don't talk so much about it having been stolen, but generally they definitely were melted down. And they were also, very often the DPWs would get rid of them because they made mowing very difficult. You know, so anything that was, you know, you'd have to pick up your mower and put it over the fence or, you know, go in through a gate, but it just made it more difficult, so they often got rid of it. I was actually at a cemetery in California, which is a much drier climate. It was in San Leandro, and up until a few years ago, they had a lot of their cast iron. It was still there, but most recently I went by and I think they had gotten rid of a lot of it. And it's a real shame because, you know, it's very rare to actually see that.
Behind the cement, that brick is the original brick in these?
So what happened here is when we were doing the restoration here, we got state money to help us with it, and that was in like 2002. So we had them go ahead and restore the bottom two tombs that you see there. So they took the stucco off because the stucco was not original to the tombs, and then it would have had a stone cap. And this cement cap has just been kept because it would be quite expensive to put stone there now. But and then the marble was cleaned and resecured. Now, one of the pieces here, we actually have the marble plaque that fell out, so we want to reinstall that. And we're looking for money to go ahead and do the rest of the restoration. As you can see, it's actually you have to be very careful. If one of those pieces falls, it could really hurt your foot. So you definitely don't want to be too close to it if it should fall. But there's a lot that actually can still be done. The one that you see there, that's the iron door, that is more typical probably of what what all of the tombs look like. They all would have had doors on them, you know, so you could go in and out. And they may have been wood or they may have been metal, but probably these were wood and they eventually, you know, became deteriorated and were bricked up. The one there was actually opened up in World War II because in World War I and in all of these other periods, Somerville had no public cemetery. I mean, this was the only public cemetery in 1840, and you had to, you know, petition, be basically a friend of the family. Well, no, as long as you're a resident of the town, you could get it. But after that time, there was no place to put those who were dying. It was primarily in like World War II that men were brought back. The city many times had discussed getting a public cemetery and had never been able to conjure up enough money to do it and and they finally did. And that's why we now have a veterans cemetery that's down over to Mass Ave in that area. So, but Clarendon Hill is the cemetery that we now have for veterans. Yep. So, but what they did until they could get Clarendon Hill developed is they opened this up and it became a holding place for the bodies that came back in World War II. So that also shows, that also shows how you would walk down to get to these. And so all of these would have been lower, you know, so you would have gone in that way.
So
So
they're
we're
all crypts.
They are, yes. Yes, these are all crypts. And the area on the back is the dirt that's just covering over these brick vaults, basically. And we are concerned there is a hole that's opened up in one. It may have been intentional. It looks quite round. And, maybe for ventilation or something. But I have been in certain historic cemeteries where the vaults have collapsed. And, it can be quite dangerous. So we don't let anybody, walk up there. But it needs to be all of this conserved and then, all of that soil put back because a lot of it's just eroded off at this point. So if we look over here, we have some great examples here of the early slate markers. So this is actually one of the earliest, and it's a footstone. If you come in October, you'll see the Ghost of Somerville, in which we have many characters who are buried here come to life and tell you about their own stories. But this one is a Mr. Samuel Kent. This is his headstone. That's his footstone. Now the footstone's been turned around. Normally it would face the other way. And it was very typical to have the headstone facing west and the footstone facing east. Some people say that was so that when the sun rose on the day of the, I suppose right after the apocalypse or during that time, that the people who were buried there were oriented to just get up and go. Also, of course, the idea of the setting sun and death, that was part of this as well. Boston has such incredible historic graveyards. There's a number of them. There's one in Roxbury that actually has pieces from the 1600s. And they have like the skulls and wings and, those kinds of figures. You don't see them here. This is a later period. And so this had a different idea of death, so it was more comforting and kind of like eternal sleep. So sometimes you also see this as if it's like a bed. And then when you look over here, you'll see the carving on these stones and slate. If you have a good piece of slate, it is fantastically permanent. So you can see that in some of these, they are just really wonderfully preserved. And there were actually 2 willows here in the 1800s that we know about. And I've been trying to get, willows back, but I don't know that we'll be able to because they're a pretty difficult tree, in terms of they tend to have a lot of branches come down and things like that, so that you have to have a lot of care with them. Yeah. But you can see the willows were very emblematic at that time of weeping. And so they're a real symbol of sorrow that you see on these. And these would be also the urns, for the ashes, very Victorian, early Victorian period. This, I believe, is like the gates. These are like the posts that would be at the gates of heaven. So as you're coming up. I think the entire shape is also somewhat reminiscent of a gate or a door that you might have, again, seen St. Peter's at, The entrance to the cemetery, you'll notice the horseshoe shape. That was because at the time they had carriages. The hearses were, of course, horse and carriage. And so when they came in, they had to go all the way around because horses are very difficult to back up. So that's why it has that shape. The fence that you see all around now dates from the 1890s, and that's the one in the front. The one on the side is later, but the one in the front is some of the best wrought iron that we have in the whole city. And that was, again, restored fairly recently by Demoulas, actually. They did that for us. And so that has all been restored, and the gates there, original to the 1890s.
Now, was this the Tufts family plot? Because this is Tufts here.
Well, again, it would be friends and family. Okay. So Thomas Rand, he is the person there who may have been, well, actually, I think there's another one.
That's a famous name, Rand.
Yes.
Are you familiar with Rand's estate? Star Market is Porter Square. That was called the Rand's estate. As a child, I moved there, and they were tearing down the estate to build that Star Market.
Oh, really?
It was called Rand's Estate.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Yes, I know that.
You remember
Yeah,
that?
yeah. Well, the Rands, actually, there was the Widow Rand, which is right here. There she is, Widow Rand. She lived to be in her 90s, age 91. And so she was actually, we have a story of her from the Revolutionary War, where, because she was living actually closer down to Granite Avenue, near where Osgood Dane had a place. And that's the Ireland estate, was down that way. And owned a lot of land. And actually just to the left of that, I just found today when I was looking at a map earlier, Columbus Tyler owned quite a bit of land to the left of that. And Columbus Tyler was a superintendent at McLean's insane asylum. And his wife was Mary Sawyer Tyler, and she was the Mary of Mary Had a Little Lamb. Yeah. So anyway, but the Rands are, the interesting anecdote is that she heard the footsteps. She was out in the morning checking on a hog that had been slaughtered, and this was in April. And so she actually heard the footsteps of the redcoats coming down Milk Row, which is right down here, which would have been a dirt road at the time. And I suppose it could have been cobblestone, but I've never heard that. But anyway, so she heard their footsteps. She came out and peeked around, saw them, then ran over to Samuel Tufts here, and he was in his basement casting musket balls with a slave at the time, his domestic servant. He only had one. And he didn't believe her, and then she had to show him the footsteps, the footprints in the dirt that showed the square-toed boot that was of the regiment. Anyway, and so then he was part also, and they were all part at that time. Everyone was a Paul Revere. Everyone was getting the word out that the regulars were coming, and they would never have said the British are coming, because they were all British. Yeah.
The British are coming and we're here too.
Yeah, that's right. So it was the regulars.
Tufts.
Oh, Tufts.
Yeah, that's Benjamin Tufts. The plots here, the amount of acreage you need for a farm is fairly large to be a successful farmer. That's one of the reasons that people tended to marry in the family, so they married their cousins and things like that. I mean, in part, it was because there weren't a lot of people around, so, and you would get together. But on the other hand, it also did help to keep the land in the family. And there are other parts of the country, I know, like in Virginia and Tennessee, where people did subdivide the land among all their children, and the land became too small to efficiently farm. It led to a lot of poverty. So it's just kind of interesting that there are, kind of differences that way. But let's go look now at right over here. This gravestone, which is the wife of Osgood Dane. And again, if you come back in October, you'll see a little more of this acted out. However, Osgood Dane, at one point, that's why we have a Dane Street here. And we also have a Frost Street, and that's also for Jonathan Frost, who's a descendant. And but the name Osgood and Dane were two names that I came across in the Salem witch trials. And it turns out that an ancestor of Osgood Dane, actually he had 3 ancestors that were all at the Salem witch trials, and that were all accused of being witches. So one of them was Osgood, the other was Dane, the other one was Wardwell. And his actual ancestor, Wardwell, had actually been the last man hung for witchcraft in Salem. As a result of that whole thing, that part of Salem became later renamed Danvers. And so that's, early on they were trying to kind of get rid of that past. But it's just a very interesting kind of history. And it's, as you know, it's quite close to Andover. And he is buried actually back at Andover in a family plot.
Street named after that Dane?
Yes. And again, he was actually a quarryman. He owned the whole quarry on Granite Street. The Granite Street is named for that quarry. So it went all the way back into a ledge, and that was all of his property there. And like I say, Widow Rand lived right across the street from him. And then, of course, we had Samuel Tufts here and Nathaniel Hawkins. Okay, so, and again, this is a symbol again of mourning, and it's the wheat sheath that has been cut down. But there's a number of things to know about it. One, it's gathered, and then it's cut down. And that is a very much of a symbol of death holding a scythe, as death is the great mower. So he comes along and he collects his due. He cuts it down and collects his due and takes it with him. There's also, you'll see broken chains. That's another one. Drooping roses. If a painting, if you see, very typically in either an early American or a European painting, you see a woman and or a man, but it's usually a woman, and she's holding a rose that is bent over and drooping. It's posthumous. It's a portrait painted of her after her death. These are actually little lambs, and they've lost their heads. Someday I might put them back, because we know what they would have looked like. But they're, of course, for children. The way that these marbles deteriorate is there are salts that, that move through the marble, and they'll move to the highest point where it's being precipitated. So anything you'll find, like a nose or the tips of the ears or something like that, those will often be missing. That's because that was the last place that water-based mineral was precipitating. So I wanted to bring you over to the monument, which is really, as you can see, they put it right in the center of the cemetery. This plot here, the family plot, this is actually, it was donated by Enoch Robinson, who you may have heard of, because he actually was the one who built the roundhouse in Somerville. And so he donated the plot. As I say earlier to some of you who were here, is you can read a huge amount of information just by taking the time to really look at this very carefully. I also have it on the website at historicsomerville.org, and you can go through and see more about it there. But I'm going to start with the very beginning here. On this side, I'm going to give a big shout out, thanks to the Garden Club who did all the planting that you see here. They're wonderful. And what you see here is that it says erected by the Somerville Light Infantry, so that's SLI, which you see down below, okay? And then it says SLI Incorporated 1853. And those militias, we have all these militias today. Well, they've been a fixture of our society since basically people started coming here and settling. So they have a long history. So the history here was that there was no federal army at the time of the Civil War. There were basically just militias for every town, and those were gathered into like state militias. But every town, this is a monument that is representing those who died from Somerville in the Civil War. So this had been incorporated earlier in 1853. There was already, talk of war for many years. Daniel Webster was one of those who basically averted civil war earlier in the 1800s. So there had been, many things leading up to this point of the Civil War. So they had already established this earlier. Now here it says, erected by the Somerville Light Infantry with the balance of a fund generously contributed by their fellow citizens in and of the company on entering the U.S. service for 3 months, April 19th, 1861, in memory of all from this town who have fallen in the service of their country. Of course, Somerville was just a town at the time. It didn't become a city until the 1870s. So April 19th, 1861. April 15th, 1861 was when General Beauregard in Fort Sumter fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, fired on Fort Sumter. That began the war. And Lincoln called for 3-month men to sign up. By the end of that week, these men had already enlisted to go fight in the Civil War. Okay? No one knew at the time how long it was going to take and what a difficult war it would be. In fact, you remember your stories that people packed picnics to go out on Bull Run and to see, you know, like, oh, let's see which side is going to win here. And they were, of course, it was very sadly mistaken. It was, of course, the long and arduous war. We can see that the very first name up there is E. Franklin Hannaford, Bull Run, July 21st, 1861. And you can see down here, the monument is telling you these men entered service for 3 months, April 19th, 1861. They were sent to protect Washington, D.C. and Virginia. They started off for Washington, D.C. because Washington, D.C. is rather close to South Carolina. It's in the middle of the country. That's why they picked Washington, D.C., remember, as the capital, so that it would be kind of equidistant from north and south. So the first thing that, you know, the Union soldiers needed to do was to secure Washington, D.C. If that had fallen to the rebels very early, you can imagine that that would have been very difficult to unseat them. So these men were sent down to guard Washington, D.C. Many of these men actually re-enlisted. That's why you see some of them died 1864 that are listed here, you know, well past 3 months. Well, they just kept enlisting again, and that's why you see that. But they were the ones who signed up first. And then after that 3-month period, it's interesting that it turned out that these civilian soldiers were really not very well equipped to serve as an army. You know, they were like bakers and artists and cabinet makers and brick makers. And, you know, some of them actually first, when they had Camp Cameron over here, which was set up, it's actually a Civil War camp that is partly in Cambridge and partly in Somerville, and it was set up here, and the men just used to leave and go into town at night and, you know, have a drink and everything else, you know, and then they'd come back the next day. They'd be late to get up, you know. So they were really not very disciplined. So there was a hiatus after this 3-month period where the Lincoln and the generals like regrouped about what they were going to do in terms of having these men just enlist. So if we go on this side, we see here that these men entered the U.S. service for 9 months, September 19th, 1862. So these men, Lincoln did not put out another call for men after that first 3-month period until September. So that's when they felt, okay, now they really had a better plan for what they were actually going to do with these men. So these men, Somerville had sent 3 full companies of men to the Civil War. So one was those men who were in the 3-month group. One was this group, which became the Massachusetts Regiment, B Regiment. And then there's another regiment that we're going to see on the side, and that was nicknamed the Somerville Guard, because there were so many men that were from the Somerville area in that particular company. So when you look here, you'll see at the bottom it says North Carolina. So that was their campaign, wound up taking them down to North Carolina. And the names that you see on here, you know, they give a lot of information. They cared very deeply about each one of these individuals. So you see right at the top, it'll say, this one says Lieutenant J. Rafferty, 9th Massachusetts, Malvern Hill, and then it gives the date of his death, July 1st, 1862. That's a lot of information to give on a memorial to every man that's on there, but they did, and they shrunk the writing down to make sure that they could actually fit it on there. These men, you'll notice here, because a lot of men were, there would be holes in regiment as men died. And so they would have to take men, and then they would take them out of this regiment and they'd plug them in here. So then you'll see that a lot of men are not in like Company B. They're over in, you know, the 99th. Some of them are in New York. So that's why you see that kind of spread over here. They're put where they're most useful. If you wanted to get promoted, the Civil War was a great place to get promoted pretty quickly because there were so many dead, they would just promote you up. So when they ran out of room, this monument was dedicated and put here in 1863 before the war ended. So how did they know how to leave the space for the people who they were going to carve their names here, right? So obviously, right from the get-go in 1861, when they were having to get the money for the bounty, which was $100 that they would give a man for signing up. There were a lot of men, by the way, who would sign up here and then they'd go to some other place. They went to Menotomy, which was later named Arlington, after Arlington down in Washington. But you know, they would go from town to town accepting the bonus and skip town, right? So they were not right. And then there were many deserters later, as we know. These are all volunteers, people who were signed up with free will. So this monument, they started planning for this monument in 1862. You know, they realized that the war was hard and that these Somerville men were going to die. And when the war started in 1860, Somerville was a town of 8,025 people. By the war's end, over 1,000 men had gone to the Civil War, had been involved with the Civil War. So if you think about it, you know, out of 8,000 people, half are women. So you've got 4,000 men. And then out of those, you've got older men, you've got younger and everything else. The ones that actually are of the age that you're looking for is a fairly small proportion of that. And almost all of them signed up for the Civil War. And then out of that, about 10% died. And the others, there was like another 20% casualty. So it had a great effect. So when they ran out of room here, they went up onto the obelisk above. And that's where you can see, you know, as they go around, you can see different carving styles from different people who are doing the engraving, making sure that, you know, someone they know and love got up there on that. So not every person who died in the Civil War from Somerville is on this monument. That's why a little over in 1900, it was about 1903, 1908, somewhere around there. That's where they put the Soldier and Sailors Monument up at City Hall, okay, in front of the library, that area. That's why there's another monument there, and that's dedicated to everyone from Somerville who died. So it's been 150 years from that conflagration. A lot of towns are marking that anniversary. So if you are all interested in the Civil War history, there's a lot of places you can go to get information about it these days. And we're going to have another talk by a professor of history on specifically the Somerville Guard, and that's going to be in November. And then we do a little, that'll be at the museum, Somerville Museum. And then we'll come down here and do a little ceremony. That is on Veterans Day. So you can look this up at historicsomerville.org, and you can find the calendar of events there, and that'll give you the information. So on this side, you see it says Captain Willard Kinsley up at the top. There were two brothers, the Kinsley brothers. They were actually from Cambridge, but they were kind of adopted by Somerville. And the other Kinsley brother actually lived. Willard Kinsley wound up dying. And if you look up here, you'll see that he died April 2nd, 1865. It was almost the last week of the war before General Lee surrendered. All of these men, as if you look here, so this is that third group. This is the group that's entered service for 3 years in 1862, okay? Now these men, a lot of them, you'll see that it says they died in prison. So it's very, you know, kind of interesting. What does that mean? Well, it meant there was a group of these men who got separated, a group of about 500 who got separated from the rest of the regiment, and they were surrounded by the Confederate troops. And this was in Virginia, and near the Rapidan River. And they wound up being taken prisoner. They were then sent to Salisbury prison, and from there they wound up going down eventually to an infamous prison called Andersonville in Georgia. And a lot of these men, where you see that they say prison, they're actually buried wherever their prison was. So a lot of the men who died at Andersonville, they actually have, Andersonville is now like a national historic kind of treasure in its own way. And they have little white crosses there for all the men who died, and they've got their names and number. And you can actually find out by going on the Civil War database where they are and their plot. And they're buried there. So a lot of these people who did die, they were buried, they weren't brought back here for the most part. They were buried on the battlefield nearby, or something like that, or near the prison. So that's again a reason, I think, for the memorial, is that because they didn't really have like a grave site that they were brought back to. So this stood for all of them. So if we go back here where we started, you'll see this is one of those corner posts for the gates, the fences. So if we look up at the top, we see that there's a coat of arms, and it says B, and that's Company B, which is basically, this started off as Company I, then it was regrouped as Company B, and those were the men who signed up on the other side for the 9 months. Up at the top it says, their warfare is over, they sleep well. And I've always felt, having learned how many men were taking advantage, either being deserters or took advantage of the bonus, and skipped town, or also all of those who were drafted. These men volunteered. I think their consciences let them sleep well. I have to say, I always say, because I just find it interesting. I'm from Alabama, and when you grow up in Alabama, one of the first things that I was ever asked, at school was, are you a Yankee or, a rebel? And when I came up here...
Where is that? Where? There or here? Here?
No, always at
there.
home. Like if going to, just to elementary school or something like that. I mean, it was one of the very first questions anybody asked you. It was like before your name, are you a Yankee or a rebel? And my parents are actually from Maryland, so I was always on the fence. But anyway, I know how much the South suffered in the Civil War. It's very clear. You hear about Atlanta, you hear about Sherman marching through. You see signs everywhere. And the North had about, 30% casualties. The South had about 50% casualties. But it wasn't until I came here and I was looking at the monument that I was so struck that in the South, you're always told that the men were fighting for their land. But what were these men fighting for? What did it take? Why did they decide to risk their lives completely, to go down there and support this unification, to keep the country unified? I mean, in my mind, it's kind of an abstract thought, that you're fighting for. But it just touched me so greatly to see the depth of their commitment, and to know this was a country, right here, that had just, not that much earlier, had fought the Revolutionary War. And, they really just believed it in their bones. And so they were able to do this. It was very interesting to me. Do any of you have questions about anything? Someone asked about, the most recent interment here, and there's a little plaque over there somewhere. Sometimes it gets covered up with grass. It's like 1970s, but otherwise you have to be a direct descendant of Samuel Tufts to be buried here, and nobody's been buried here since then.
Can't pay your dollar.
Can't pay your dollar anymore. The city took over the place in the 1890s. That's when the fence went up and all of this. The little schoolhouse that was there, that was taken down around, the 1840s.
Well, my name is Brandon Wilson, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm here as Executive Director for the Somerville Historic Preservation Commission, which is the group that is sponsoring this tour today along with Historic Somerville, which Barbara heads up. And I want to welcome you all here today. It's great to see you. I know some of you were on the Jane's Walk yesterday that we did. This is Preservation Month, so this is the second event of the month that we're doing on the beginning of May, the whole month of May. I have calendars here if anybody wants to know. We have about 6 more events coming up. And Barbara, as obviously, knows a huge amount about this cemetery, both because of her professional background as a conservator, and but also because she has been very involved with it through Historic Somerville, and helping me as part of the Preservation Commission and doing some of the restoration work here. We've been able to benefit from some state grants in doing work here. We actually got money to do a preservation master plan back in 2002. And that master plan has been guiding what we've been doing ever since in terms of doing restoration and protection of the cemetery. As you probably know, having lived here for many years, it used to be wide open to the public, and unfortunately it is no longer because of the fragile condition of it. And so we want to preserve it and continue to restore it, and hopefully we will have it open on a more regular basis. And we are looking for docents. We started a docent program last summer. Docents are people that would come in here and open up the cemetery and make it available to people to come in on Sundays. We're calling it seasonal Sundays. And so we had several people doing that last year, and we'll have some more hopefully this year, but we are looking for a couple more if anyone's interested. And the work that we've been doing in here, as Barbara I think has already indicated, was on the tombs. We did a lot of work. Certainly the Civil War monument has been restored, and a number of the gravestones and markers. But we do have a lot more work to do. I'm sure you can see that there's some tombs that need some serious attention. And then we have some markers that don't seem to be still standing. And we even have some that aren't actually out, that have fallen over and that we've preserved elsewhere. So we would like to do that. And so we're always looking for donations to help in that cause. We also did some restoration work from another state grant that we got. And so we're hoping that we'll be able to continue doing that kind of work over the next couple of years. We have a friend through the Market Basket, Demoulas, has been very generous, and they're the ones that helped us completely restore and fix up the fence, which if you've lived here for a long time, is in very tough shape. So that's great, because this is wrought iron. That's one of the only wrought iron that's original left in the city. And actually, as part of the restoration work, it's kind of fun, is that fence, you might notice, has a top and a bottom that's decorative. And when, for many, many years, it was actually no decoration on the bottom, it was all in concrete. And it wasn't until we went to do the restoration that we discovered that it actually had been covered up, someone in their greater wisdom. And so we've been able to restore it back to the way it originally looked. So. And then the plantings in here, as Barbara mentioned, we really owe huge appreciation to the Somerville Garden Club. A couple of members of the Historic Somerville group, as well as the Garden Club, have been instrumental in planting in here in the Civil War Monument, as well in other parts of the cemetery. And so we hope to do some more of that as well. And then I think Barbara's probably mentioned that she would like to get a willow tree back in here, which I've given her the bad news that we're probably not going to. The willow tree will not return, probably because what I've learned from the city's arborist is that willow trees have very shallow roots, and therefore they're prone to falling over in storms. And I don't need to tell anyone here that we've had a lot of storms, and so therefore they could actually damage further the gravestone. So we will find another appropriate tree for the period, some kind of a weeping tree. We will look for. Yes, I'm certainly going to talk about the elm. She has her Civil War monument, and I have my American elm heritage tree that I'm very, very fond of and want to make sure that it's preserved. It's way over 100 years old. We don't know exactly when it was planted, or even when it was planted. It might have been a volunteer. But it is, I don't need to tell anybody, a very majestic tree, and a very significant one, particularly in this part of Somerville, which in Union Square has a dearth of trees until recently when we redid Somerville Avenue. We planted a lot more trees. But this site is like an oasis in this area of Somerville, with a parking lot next door of Demoulas and such. It really is a very important treasure we have here, and this tree is probably the most prominent feature here, with the exception, of course, of this monument. So in order to protect it, we've been advised about there's some treatment that needs to be done. Fortunately, it has not succumbed to the elm disease that did happen a number of decades ago, but to make sure that doesn't happen, we are actually going to retaining a company to do this treatment starting this spring, in fact, the next week or so, both in the spring and then again in the fall as well. So I'm very pleased that DPW has agreed to do that work. It's been many years in the needed, and they've stepped up to the plate. So I'm thrilled about that. It's a tree that actually is very graceful and just makes the cemetery feel like it is really a very special place. And I
mention one thing about it?
Sure, oh, absolutely.
Oh, I just wanted to mention this is an American elm. It has not been infested with Dutch elm disease. There used to be elms all up and down the street here, and it was kind of famous for that. If you look back in murals of American history of about late 1700s, there was a itinerary painter named Rufus Porter, and he used to go from town to town, and he would paint these murals in exchange for like living there and he would do dance classes. He really did everything. He also founded Scientific American. Anyway, he went throughout all of New England doing this, and he painted a lot of elms, and they are so gorgeous. So if you ever get a chance to see these paintings, or if you're looking at paintings of America at that time of New England, you will see these trees there, and they're really very distinctive.
So, I mean, that's the other things the city's been working on in recent years. We now have benches in here, so if you are able to come in here and sit and relax, and that's the hope on Sundays, that you'd be able to come in here and really enjoy the environment here. And obviously on the Somerville Avenue, we've made a lot of improvements there and such. And this is now ADA accessible, the site, which was another very important piece for us to have done. So we have a lot more things planned as well. I do have some brochures here if people are interested. I mentioned the master plan. This is a summary of the master plan, which is a much more extensive document. Should you be interested in the full master plan, as well as this document, you can see it online for the website for the Somerville Historic Preservation Commission. We have a website, www.somervillema.gov/historic preservation. So you can read more about the cemetery. And Barbara's already mentioned that Historic Somerville also has a website that has a lot of information on it too, and I urge you to pursue it there.
I urge you to join and help
Yes.
us support. It's only $25 and we do all kinds of stuff like this.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of volunteer efforts that make these things possible, and so if you're at all interested or have other friends, we urge you to let us know. And the cemetery is really only otherwise open generally in October, when we do the Ghosts of Somerville, which Historic Somerville has been instrumental in sponsoring each year. And that's a very fun day that you come in and you'll learn about each of the different people that are residing here, I guess you could say, but through the high school students in many cases. Somerville High School, we formed a local history club with one of the history teachers, Ada Santos, has been wonderful. And so a number of the students have really enjoyed getting dressed up in period attire, such as Barbara and I are wearing. And then they learn about the characters that are here, and talk to people about them and have a conversation with you about it. So it's another time to maybe come in as well. It's generally the same day as the city's Summerfest, which is when we close down all of Somerville Avenue, invite people to explore the avenue and all the things along it. So, when is it? That's in October. It's usually I want to say the second week in October, second Saturday in October, but it'll be on the website. It's certainly in that.
No, it's the 3rd.
Is it the 3rd? Okay.
Closer to Halloween.
Yes, you're right, because we used to do the 4th, right? So the 3rd. It's the last festival, street festival that the city does. As you probably know, we do one on each of the major streets. So, but it's a fun opportunity to learn more about the people that are here and see the kinds of clothing that were worn during those times and such. And so, as you probably have noticed, we're in different attire than normal. And I don't know if Barbara's mentioned hers is Civil War period.
Yeah. I bet you didn't know that.
And I'm the Colonial representative here because it goes back to that time. And I have to say that some people feel as if they were born in the wrong era and they wish they were able to wear this kind of clothing. I'm not one of them. I'm doing this for the love of history and the cemetery, but I must say that thank you. I must say this bustle in the back is just not my thing, and driving my vehicle here, which didn't happen to be a horse and carriage as it should have been, was more difficult. And so I think that, but it's fun to see what they wore. I must say it does. One of the reasons we do this, we just did Patriots Day celebration for the city, and we have a Colonial Fair, as we call it, up at Foss Park, and sort of have recreate those times. And we have a lot of volunteers, high school students as well as other volunteers in the city that get dressed up in colonial attire and such. And so you get to see what they wore during those days and experience firsthand. Some of those clothing are really tough, to do a lot of things, and it takes a lot of time to get dressed in the morning and get going and to move around and things. And so, I think that's important for us to appreciate, to go back in time and understand a little bit more about what they had to encounter and endure.